All right, well, good afternoon to all of you. So today's topic is TM30. As you all know, that's about tanks and tactical maneuvers and machine guns. This is the other TM30. Now today's topic is color rendering. So the CIE definition here, the effect of an illuminant on the color appearance of objects by conscious or subconscious comparison with the color appearance under a reference illuminant. Sort of a technical definition. The more simple definition, the effect of light on objects' appearance as judged by a human observer. That's sort of my own definition, a little bit simpler. So that's the definition of color rendering, but what about color rendering measures or metrics, and what do they do for us? So they help us to understand, communicate, engineer, compare, predict. So they're ways to quantify this phenomenon that we experience visually, but they're incredibly important to us in the lighting field. So today's topic, I have 10 sections to it. They aren't that long, all of them, and if we don't get through all of them, that's okay too. I'll stop and take questions at various points throughout. You don't have to hold them exactly to the end, but we'll talk a little bit about CRI and how we started there and how we're at TM30. Overviews of TM30. We have some live demonstrations. I'll go through the Excel tool that comes with TM30. Sort of updates, what else is going on with CIE and NEMA, all other people that are interested in TM30. So the first part, CRI to TM30, why are we here today? So as requested, I'll give a brief overview of CRI for those of you, many of you I'm sure are familiar with it. Some of you might have heard about it sometime in the past, put it out of your mind and never really cared other than to look at a number. But this is the basic process for how we calculate it. So we determine the CCT of the source that we're interested in. We determine a reference source at that same CCT. We look at test samples, theoretically, and we calculate the chromaticity of those test colors under the test and reference illuminant, and then we're calculating the difference between those two. So CRI is only a measure of color fidelity. It doesn't tell us anything about how things are changing, it only tells us the magnitude of the difference. So that's a pretty big limitation. I'll show you that a little bit more as we go forward. Just to sort of step through that little process step by step. So if we have a test source, we're comparing it to a reference illuminant at the same CCT. Here, I'm just showing a light bulb. A reference illuminant is actually a mathematical calculation at the exact CCT. It's not an actual lamp. Very similar, though, at the right CCT to an incandescent lamp black body radiator. What we're really comparing there, we're not actually shining any lamps. We're comparing the spectral power distribution for those two sources. So this mathematical distribution of the emitted light over the range of wavelengths. So what we're then yep, question?
A reference illumination is based on what an average human being would see as considered equal distribution for their eye and an accurate. I don't understand what the reference illumination is really, because you first compared to what appeared to be an incandescent light bulb, but I wanted to make sure that it was actually, that you're actually stating that it's real world to what a human would perceive.
So the reference illuminant is another light source. In the CRI, it's either Planckian radiation, which is similar to an incandescent light bulb, except it's varying in CCT. You can mathematically model it at any CCT. And at 5,000 K, it switches over to a model of daylight. So it's just a numerical calculation that represents daylight at different CCTs. So you match the CCT of that reference source to whatever light source you're actually calculating. So you're comparing two different light sources. And the reason for choosing those is relatively arbitrary. Daylight and Planckian radiation can be mathematically modeled, and they're sort of natural light sources, sort of what our eye developed under seeing under. So that's something we want to compare to. It's really just a point of comparison, though.
So, but now it sounds like you're saying that it's also a color temperature reference.
Yes, it's at the same color temperature as the test source.
Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm.
And so what we're doing with those is we're looking at color samples, essentially. That's trying to give us an average representation. In CRI, we only have 8 samples. They're kind of pastel samples, and they're pretty limited. There are 6 additional samples that aren't in the average CRI value, RA. They're special indices, so if you've heard of R9, it's probably the most frequently used one, but there's 5 other additional ones as well, saturated colors. 13 is sort of supposed to be a skin tone, and 14 is a foliage color. Pretty rarely used. And again, what we're really doing is looking at the reflectance function of those objects. So we're not actually taking any lights and shining them on any objects. There's no actual measurement. We're doing this all mathematically. We've measured the lamp, spectral power distribution. All these have been measured. So it's the reflectance at each wavelength going across. So we're mathematically multiplying that spectral power distribution from the lamp and these reflectance functions. And from that, we get chromaticity coordinates. So theoretically, we get these two sets of chromaticity coordinates shown up there at the top. And what we're really plotting is the numerical coordinates, UV shown there down on the bottom. And we're then simply comparing how similar are those sets of chromaticity coordinates. So each pair, we can calculate the difference, and we're scaling that number and subtracting it from 100. That gives us our final CRI score. So I mentioned there's sort of a limitation to only considering a fidelity, and I'll explain that visually here. So if this is our original and baseline image, say this is our reference image, and this is all done theoretically. These aren't actually relit spaces. But say then I have another source here, CRI 80 source, and it's producing this desaturating effect. So if I flip back and forth here, you can see it says that was my reference condition, and my CRI is not perfect, so I don't have exact match to that reference, it's somewhat lower, and in this case it's desaturating. I could go do the same thing though, same score, same amount of difference from that reference, but instead of desaturating, now I'm saturating. So I have these very different effects. With CRI, they're rated the same. So how would I have any way of distinguishing between those? And that's one of the major limitations of CRI. So there's sort of technical limitations. CRI has been around 50 years. The math can be improved. But this is one of the major philosophical limitations of really only thinking about fidelity when we think about color rendering. So just to explain that a slightly different way, the more engineering way, I guess, instead of the design-oriented way, say we have this axis system and perfect fidelity is in the middle. So I can alter that scene with the lighting. I can increase saturation, I can decrease saturation, I can shift hues one way or I can shift hues another way. I can have 2 points going in opposite directions that have the same CRI score because they're the same amount of distance from that center point. Really, I can have this whole circle here of constant fidelity. Any of these combinations of shifts, saturation, desaturating, hue shifts, all have the same score because they're all the same distance from that center point, which is all CRI is intended to calculate. So just some history now about, well, we've recognized this for a long time. Even sort of soon after CRI came out, there was new research saying, well, maybe we don't want to just consider fidelity. So there's, if you've heard of the color preference index or the flattery index, those have been around since the 70s where people realized, maybe it's not just the similarity of the reference that we want to consider. So there have been a couple revisions of CRI, 1974 being the major one. It changed a lot 9 years after it was adopted to what we generally are using today. It was reaffirmed in 94, 95, just to fix a couple typos, but no major changes. The CIE since the 80s has been working on color rendering measures. TC-133 committee was not successful in its purposes, mainly due to disagreement between those who advocated including the advances of science and those who recommended the industry did not want to change. This is kind of interesting. This comes from 1999 is when they closed. There's still a little bit about that debate going on today. We can show how much better we can be today. There's still some in the industry that says, CRI is good enough, let's just stick with it, it's not worth the change. So hopefully you'll see today as I go through this presentation that at least I really advocate that it's certainly worth changing. It certainly doesn't come easily and instantly. It does require some effort, but we can do a lot better, and I think it's our job to do so. So another committee, TC-162. This is another important quote, and I think it still applies today as well. The committee recommends the development of a new color rendering index. This index shall not replace the current CIE color rendering index immediately. The usage of the new index or indices should provide information supplementary to the current CRI, and replacement of CRI will be considered after successful integration. So just this point that suddenly, because TM30 is available, doesn't mean CRI goes out the window and everyone today starts publishing TM30 values. It's going to take some time to transition from one to the other. CRI doesn't become defunct in any way. It's still around. It still characterizes things the way they were characterized before. We can learn a lot more with TM30. Just some other updates. Again, you might have been familiar that CIE has been working on this very recently and currently. TC-169 sort of didn't reach a universal agreement and split into two groups, one looking at color fidelity measures only, another looking at color preference measures only. This group, TC190, is actually using TM30 now as a working draft to move forward, and I expect something to come out of that group officially within about a year. So then the IES Colorimetrics Task Group came along. We formed in 2013. The idea was CIE's been working on this a long time. Can the IES do something in the meantime to sort of move this process forward, not necessarily reinvent the wheel, but just say, we've learned a heck of a lot of things already. Can we sort of consolidate that and formalize it into a document so people can start using it immediately? So who was the Colorimetrics Task Group? There were 7 of us. We were working sort of underneath the IES Color Committee. So it included representatives from manufacturing, sort of the research government side, and the specification side, so that all those viewpoints could come into this without necessarily having a very large number of people. We're trying to move fast in about a year. You know, if you get 40 or 50 people all trying to get their opinions in, it can kind of just slow things down. So the idea was keep it small, but keep all views represented, and then formalize the document and turn it over to a broader group for more scrutiny as well. So where did the ideas come from for this? And we'll get into what the actual document says, but the 2-metric concept, there's been a lot of that out. You might have heard of CRI plus gamut area index. Also, CQS sort of had this multiple metrics type of approach. So we pulled in those ideas where we can't just consider fidelity, we need to consider multiple aspects of color rendering. Graphic displays, some of you might have heard of color rendering vectors. If we have a lot of information, we can get 1,000 points, we can plot these visually and show vectors about how different regions of color space are changing. Using modern color science, other metrics have been proposed recently using what's called CAMO2 UCS. You've heard of chromaticity diagrams, probably XY, UV maybe. This is just an updated version of that that's more visually uniform, so that a change of the same magnitude in any part of color space is equal to our perception, which works a lot better when you deal with color rendering measures. And then wavelength uniformity of samples. We don't want the samples to unduly bias the results. Say there's certain wavelengths that are particularly important with CRI. We want to have that sort of neutral, so it's an average representation of the world, rather than this sort of skewed, very small sample that you can tailor a light source to do really well for just those samples, but it might not do well when it's actually installed out in the world. So the balloting process, as I mentioned, we worked under the Color Committee. So it was validated by the task group, validated by the Color Committee, validated by the TRC, and validated by the Board of Directors. Each of those groups has 30 days, and then you have to have discussion on responses. So you can see it takes a little while. So we were done in just over a year, and this took almost another year of going through this balloting process. I think there were, amongst all these groups, 2 votes of disapproval, which is like 96% approval rate, which I think is really good. Again, as I mentioned, there's some disagreement of, well, we should just stick with CRI, and that's more where those disapproval votes came from. There's, at least to date, been no one who has really had major technical objections to what we've done. It's more of an issue of, should we be doing this at all? So the broad relationship between CRI and TM30 now, just to sort of compare where we were and where we've gone to. CRI fidelity metric only, TM30 providing a lot more information on fidelity, gamut, saturation, graphical measures, detailed measures. So it provides this whole suite of information rather than this single number that only measures really one simple version of color rendering. An updated color space. I'll go through each of these in more detail in a few moments. 8 color samples, we've moved to 99 color samples. And those color samples, that was a big part of the development. So how do you get to those 99 samples? And I'll take a look at that a little bit more later. But the important thing is that they have uniform coverage of color space. So instead of just being pastels, they really cover saturated colors, all hues, desaturated colors, more complete representation that forms a better average then for representing the real world. Uniform spectral sensitivity, and they're all real objects, so we weren't just making up reflectance functions, but they actually came from a library of 105,000 measured objects, and we used a statistical model essentially to down select from that 105,000 to get these features in a set of 99. We mentioned the reference illuminant for CRI. We carried those same references over to TM30, so we're still using black body radiation and models of daylight. The only difference is instead of a sharp change at 5,000 K, there's sort of a blending of the two between 4,500 K and 5,500 K. It's really a minor difference. It helps when you have color-tunable sources that are actually moving across that boundary, so you don't have a little blip in the score. It doesn't let someone sort of game the system by making something 4999K to use one reference instead of 5001K to use the other reference. The scale, we applied a logarithmic transformation to the scale to make the lower limit 0. A lot of people thought the lower limit for CRI was 0, but it actually could have been anything because you're just subtracting from 100. So if you just apply a logarithmic transformation, it only affects the scores less than 20, which essentially are not really used anyway for interior lighting. But it keeps this simpler so that what people think it was, it actually is. Okay, so what is it and what isn't it? So TM30 is a method that includes several measures and metrics. It doesn't establish any criteria. Criteria is something that Energy Star or DLC or individual designers develop for their own projects. That's criteria. TM30 is completely agnostic on that front. It doesn't tell you what a good source is, what a bad source is. It simply describes the mathematical calculations to determine the numbers. It doesn't provide any design guidance. The IES Color Committee is working on DG1 that will provide more of that type of information. And it's technically at this point not a required standard, so it's a voluntary calculation procedure. It's not been yet adopted by ANSI or ISO. So the same way that CRI is actually just a technical report describing the color rendering index, that's what we have now for TM30. And as it gets used and as we go through a process of development and revision and reach industry consensus, it can then be adopted by ANSI or ISO as a required standard for reporting. And then someday, sort of like CRI, 50 years, it's made it. But it'll probably reach obsolescence too. We're not claiming this is the final end-all and be-all of color rendering. It's going to be an active area of research probably as long as interior lighting is around. Any questions? That was sort of a lot of overview information. I'm going to talk about it in more detail going forward. But any questions immediately on those sections? All right, that's okay. I think you'll get more interested in the later slides. So this is sort of the broad overview of TM30 itself. One of the key things, it has a core calculation engine, so all of these measures and outputs are coming from the same set of color samples, the same calculation framework. So they all work with one another and have obvious trade-offs from one to the other. So you might be familiar with the system, say CRI plus gamut area index. Now, that's been proposed. Well, those two systems don't work as well together because they're not based on the same reference illuminant and the same calculation framework. So this, we sort of combined that idea but made the improvement while we're working off one calculation engine here. So we have high-level average values, the fidelity index and the gamut index. The gamut index telling us the overall degree of saturation instead of just the fidelity index telling us the similarity to the reference. Again, I'll go through each of these more individually. We have graphical representations, so a simple visual way to make evaluations rather than numerical, and I think these are really useful. And then a lot of detailed values, so if you're interested in skin fidelity, there's a measure for that. If you're interested in certain hues, reds or blues or greens, there's indices for those. If you're interested in how those are changing in saturation rather than just fidelity, indices for those. Or if you want to look at all 99 samples individually, you can do that as well. So there's a very lovely picture of the 99 color samples.
Do you think that's accurate?
No, this is not accurate. Good point. So these are all theoretical. These are reflectance functions. This is sort of a computer simulation of them, which is then put on a projector and projected up here. So there's obviously limitations to doing that. But just to give you an idea of the scope of what is being covered, we have very light samples, very saturated samples, some of the reds up there, some of the yellows, some of the greens. Again, this is what they actually are. So they're represented by this numerical data, which that's probably a lot harder for a lot of you to understand than this type of image. Right? So it's this three-dimensional ball, essentially covering the sphere of color. So if we think of the sphere of color, we have saturation sort of going in and out on that ball. We have hue going around in a circle, and sort of darkness and lightness in the other dimension. So it's covering all three dimensions to get this sphere of color, which then is represented by these reflectance functions. Again, if you want to compare those to the 8 we're using, you can sort of see why having 99 becomes a lot more difficult to sort of cheat in game, as opposed to just using these 8 samples, a pretty limited representation of the colors in the world. So if you're curious how they compare in a 2-dimensional plot, and I'll show a lot of 2-dimensional plots, but I just want to reiterate that it's this 3 dimensions that we're working in. It's really hard to see that when you put it on a screen. So a lot of these plots will sort of show a slice where everything's been compressed down onto a 2-dimensional plane. So the red dots here, so the 99 color samples from TM30. The blue diamonds, these are the CRI test color samples. The lighter ones are the special ones, your R9 through R14. If any of you are familiar with CQS, those are plotted as the green triangles. So CQS went a different route. They just went saturated samples. CRI was kind of these low saturation samples and then augmented with some really saturated samples. So TM30 tried to sort of fill that whole area and say, well, let's not just use one, saturated or pastels, let's use everything and consider it all equally. So this might help you a little more. So this is actually common objects here. So what is actually shown in here? And these aren't objects that are actually in the set. They could be, actually. I don't know exactly what each one represents, although we have that data available. So some of these things are actually over there because they're measured. So for example, the comet, I don't think the Irish Spring is out. The Oreos, Crunch Bars are down here as well. Ketchup, mustard, Dr. Pepper. So it really covers pretty much the whole range of common goods. Yeah.
On the nerds, are you referring to the candy or people?
Whatever you want it to refer to. And then these are, more natural objects. These are pretty artificial objects, but you can see where a lot of natural things kind of plot. And so the color samples cover this full range of objects. This is probably one of the more technical slides on here. So this refers to spectral uniformity. And there was a big equation to get this, but this is one of the criteria for selecting those 99 samples. So if we look at the CRI or the CQS samples, there's bias in the wavelengths because they have so few samples and they weren't really selected in a way to try and minimize that. They actually came all from the Munsell set, which has a limited number of pigments in it. So when you have those limited number of pigments, there's certain spectral features in those reflectance functions that are more prominent. So you can see there's sort of this bias that results where certain wavelengths have more of an effect than others. And the premise of the group was that is not something that exists in actually all the objects in the world. So we shouldn't be trying to include that in a model that's predicting what's actually going on out in the world. And lacking any data of an actual representative sample of all the objects in the world in proper proportions, we said, well, let's make it neutral, because that seems like the most logical way to do it. So you can see, comparing the 99 samples to the others, we get this relatively flat spectral sensitivity. So why does this matter? So this is from a recent paper. If you want to look in Lucos, you can. It probably deserves a lot more explanation than I'll give it here in one slide. But if we model some sources here, we have a fixed blue, fixed green, and we're moving the red. And this is laser lines, essentially, just as a model. We're moving that to different wavelengths. And this is just sort of a blow-up of that red section of this area here. So how is the CRI score and the TM30 score changing? And these are actually just based on the samples. It's not the actual. So we imported the CRI samples into the TM30 framework. So it's just comparing the sample set. But you can see you reach these local minima and maxima here that actually aren't represented when you consider a spectrally flat set. And so this sort of would allow you to, well, I would want to place my red here or here to get that little boost, that little benefit, when that might actually not be beneficial in the overall grand scheme. So you can get up to 12 points difference between RA and RF based on just this alone.
So what you're saying is I can't dope something to have little spikes to give me a high CRI. It has to be a little bit more real.
Yeah. So with CRI, you can sort of play around with those wavelengths, and you'll see a boost in score, your CRI score. But that's probably not going to be an actual boost when you put it in a room. And so when you have 99 samples with that neutrality of the samples, you can start moving around, but you're going to affect one sample as soon as you improve another one. All those features in there, that spaghetti plot, you can't really game it. So on color space uniformity, so when we had the old color space, again, this is sort of the technical section. If we move to different CCTs, the shape of that color volume changed, and it wasn't always sort of spherical. And so certain changes became a heavier influence on the score than other changes. So you can sort of see, this should be red, this should be gray. Sorry, that's probably confusing. But this is the CAM02 UCS color space, and this is the CIE 1964 color space that was used for CRI. So you can see it loses its uniformity as you change around to different CCTs. It's sort of this amorphous blob changing. So you can get up to 6 points difference between RA and RF, just based, if you consider everything else equal and just change the color space that they're calculating. So again, sort of summing all these together, you're adding up to a lot of error in that calculation of RA compared to using this RF. Okay, any questions? Pretty technical part. All right, I'm going to keep going. This is probably more relevant to most of you, the actual outputs that are coming out of this. It's sort of nice to know some of that background of what is going on in that black box, but if you want to consider that a black box and never think about it, that's certainly one reasonable way to do it. So again, we have that black box, that calculation engine. And from there, we're calculating color difference for those 99 color samples. From that, we can take the average of that color difference, calculate color fidelity. We can group it into 16 bins, take the average in each bin. From there, we can calculate the gamut index. We can calculate graphics and calculate things for those individual hue bins. So this is sort of what I'm going to go through next. I'm going to step through that process and talk about each of those individual values.
So why are you binning them into groups from those measurements?
Yeah, I'll explain exactly how that process works.
Can you repeat the questions, or people use the mic?
Yeah, sorry. So the question was, why do you bin them? And I'm going to get to that in a few slides. So again, when we get to color difference here, this is again flattened to 2 dimensions. This is going on in 3 dimensions. So we're calculating, just like we were with CRI, chromaticity under the test and reference source. So in this case, the black is the reference source, the red is the test source. We have all these pairs of coordinates in here. We have 99 different pairs. And so for each one, you saw a little green arrow pop up on the screen there. We're calculating the difference, just a Euclidean distance formula. So basically, A minus B squared, B minus, the formula there. From that, we can calculate for each of those 99. So we have each of those color difference for each point. Same process as CRI. We scale it and subtract from 100. And then again, that logarithmic transformation there to set the lower limit at 0. Pretty irrelevant for most things. But you can see we have 99 now calculations of how different that one sample is from its corresponding sample under the reference illuminant. To get RF, the average fidelity value, we just take the average there of each of the 99 color difference. So that's why it's an average of those 99. There are a lot of limitations to averages. So it doesn't tell us what area is good, what area is bad. Something to keep in mind as you think about how I use averages and what it means, and how I can supplement that with additional information. So we also have a skin index, RF skin. So 2 of those samples were specifically made to be skin tones. That's something that's generally important to people in lighting. We just simply take the average of those 2 samples, their individual scores, and we can get RF skin. A lot of people ask, well, how do these 2 skin tones represent all skin tones? So those 2 actually were selected because they are the best correlated to a library of 5,000 measured skin tones. So, and actually kind of unique, skin tones, their reflectance functions are not very different from one another. There's some difference in the sort of overall magnitude of the reflectance, but the actual spectral features, very little difference. So those two actually can be very representative of a broad range of skin tones. Okay, this gets now to the Hue bins, the question. So if we take that plot, we slice it up 16 slices of pie. What we can do with that then is calculate the average chromaticity in each. So you see 16 pins, average chromaticity in each. So what that allows us to do, I'm going to get into the vector graphic first, and then we'll get to what we can do from there. So we can then normalize each of these 16 pairs to a circle. We can transfer the color difference from sort of the average bin to that circle, do that 16 times, and now we have this graphic showing all the distortions in the hue plane. So it'll show me that here, anytime I'm moving in, that's a decrease in saturation in that hue area. If I'm moving out, that's an increase in saturation. And if I'm shifting along that circle, it's a hue shift. So I think this is one of the most interesting things in TM30, because it allows a very quick visual representation of what's going on with this source. So this one, for example, is saturating some of the yellows and blues, and really desaturating reds and greens. And I can get that sort of instantly just from this graphic. Now, so if I go back to this example from early on, we had the CRI scores. Now, actually, I didn't explain RG yet. I should put the slide in after the next one. But we can now see with this graphic what exactly is going on here. So this one's increasing the saturation of reds. This one's decreasing the saturation of reds. So visually with that graphic, I can see what's going on in that image and match it up pretty easily. So it kind of looks intimidating at first, but I think once you understand that concept, this tells you a whole lot more than any average number can tell you.
Will it tell you the amount?
The graphic, so it'll show you relative amounts if you compare two. I can also, good question, basically convert that to numbers. So I can look at that graphic. This is essentially, if I go around each of those arrows, this is breaking it down, the fidelity score, and the change in saturation. So if I want to create a numerical spec and say, oh, I want always to increase the saturation of reds, which is Hue Bin 1, then I want that to be a certain value, a positive change.
Go back to that last slide.
Mm-hmm.
And now, just visually with my eye, the original and the red enhanced are close. They're not identical, but they're extremely close to my eye. But the one in the middle is significantly off.
So,
but I look at your graph, and it looks to be about the same between the red enhanced and the original. You know, the differences seem to be a lot different than what the visual experience is.
So this is a complete illustration. These sources have nothing to do with what was actually there. There's just sort of a graphical example of that. I mean, these are all digitally manipulated, and this was like, so this is actually a big boost in red compared to the original. Just in Lightroom, you know, jack up the reds in the image. So these are sort of things that roughly correspond to what I changed in Lightroom to make that change. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yep.
Use the graphic to determine hue shift. I understand the saturation versus desaturation, but if it shifts along the curve, I don't know how you see that in a graph about like a 0.
Yeah, so these arrows here, so if you see if that's tangential to this black circle, which is the reference, the red is the test source, you know that these hues are shifting from sort of a more orange to a more yellow with that arrow there.
So if they overlap each other and keep the same saturation, would the arrows be drawn outside of it or something so you can still see?
Yeah, so I mean, some arrows can be really small. Sorry.
Just repeat it so they can hear.
All right. To repeat, I was wondering if when they have the same saturation, if you'll be able to see the arrows. It might be because I'm in the back of the room and I didn't see arrows in general. But I was wondering if the hue shift, how it could be captured in the graphic, and if it was.
Yeah, so there are arrows there, and I think if you see this on a computer screen in front of you, they might be more apparent. But you'll see an arrow plotted on top of these lines.
So basically the arrow follows the curve, it just changes from...
It's just a hue change. So you're becoming more red to more orange, or more yellow to more green, or more blue to more purple. So we can calculate each of those numerically as well. This is just basically a breakdown numerically of those vectors, which can be pretty useful if you're, for example, you were concerned about R9 in the past. Well, you might be concerned about Hue Bin 1 reds, changes right here. So you have numbers that can convey that. But you can also, instead of just having one for red, and there was blue, green, and yellow as well in the CRI system saturated, we have 16 of those as well here.
So how do you know what those values need to be good or perfect, or...
So if you're concerned with fidelity, if you want a perfect match to the reference, all those would be 100. So it's on the same scale.
99 samples that you're referencing.
So the reference is the reference illuminance. So that's your Planckian radiation, essentially incandescent type light, or a model of daylight. There it's always at the same CCT. So that does sort of put an emphasis on those as reference illuminance. So in the past, there's always been this idea, well, we need to make fidelity as high as we can. That we're just making these as similar as possible to these reference illuminants. The thing is, those reference illuminants aren't special, and they aren't necessarily the best sources for lighting a space.
They're very different to the daylight versus the incandescent.
Well, so it's changing. It's not one or the other. So it's at exact CCTs. So these are models. So they're actually pretty similar at the same CCT. A Planckian radiation is just a smooth curve, and daylight has a little bit of, the sun is just a big Planckian radiator, essentially. We get a little bit of filtering in the atmosphere that changes it a little bit. I'll get more to that. Question back here?
Yeah, I think to clarify on that, I think part of this is, one, recognizing where you're getting to, where we're looking for what is that mean, that ideal we're shooting for, so that way people too can vary for their specific uses.
Yes. Yes, I have more sections on this coming up, but the point is, in the past we've been in this mode where you want your highest CRI value possible. And all that did was say we want it as similar to these reference sources as possible, when those aren't necessarily the best sources for a space. What TM30 allows us to do is understand how it's different from that reference. So is, for example, this warm light, maybe I want to increase the saturation of blues because I know under an incandescent lamp, I can't really tell the difference between blues and blacks and purples. So with this information, I could say, okay, I want to increase my saturation in the blue regions relative to that reference because I know that's going to be better for my application here where I'm lighting a sock drawer, whatever you might be doing. So there's a whole couple question.
What is your anticipation of what we're going to see from manufacturers and testing in the future? Should people actually start implementing this and using it, which means having it tested appropriately by the proper testing methods and then having various things to show us. So we're going to still have a CRI, right? But what are we going to actually see from manufacturers, do you anticipate, on a specific product that we'll be able to use to make those determinations? I mean, do you anticipate that they're going to be publishing these curves and tables as you're showing, or just some run numbers?
So one important thing, you don't have to measure anything additional to calculate this. You already measured your spectral power distribution to get CRI. So this is just a matter of calculations. And I know major manufacturers are already working this into their automatic software so that anytime they take a measurement, this is all calculated already. So it's very minimal extra work to provide this data to anyone who wants it. In terms of what people actually provide, it's going to be up to them, and it's going to be a bit of a supply and demand issue. If people are asking for it, I fully expect manufacturers will provide it. I know some manufacturers are already providing it. They might not, probably on a spec sheet, you're not going to see this level of detail. But if you can get a spectral power distribution from them, IES is providing a calculator that goes along with this, and I'll demonstrate it in a bit. You can calculate all this and compare all you want.
Thank you.
They'll probably be providing the high-level numbers, and the vector graphic is what at least the first major person that provided data has done.
That circle that
Mm-hmm.
showed them how it...
Will this information come from chip manufacturers or from the luminaire manufacturers?
Wherever you got your color information in the past, I would expect them to provide it. So The
Would
chip
there be a
manufacturers
difference?
are ultimately going to have to do the spectral engineering because the chips are the ones that define the spectrum of the source predominantly. I mean, you could have reflectors in there somehow affecting it, but usually then that information is actually provided by the luminaire manufacturer to the specifier. So it's a combination of both. Sort of the whole supply chain needs to let the information flow. All right. So now if we take those same 16 averages, we can connect the dots and create polygons. We can compare the area of those two polygons, and that gives us the RG score. So that's the other high-level average value, which is just comparing the area of these two polygons. So on average, is one bigger than the other, which means it's an average increase in saturation, or is one smaller than the other, which is an average decrease in saturation. The reference is set at 100, so anytime your value is above 100, the test source is greater than the reference, it's an average increase in saturation. If the number is less than 100, it's an average decrease in saturation. Again, like your average fidelity value RF, it's an average. So you don't know whether it's increasing everywhere or just increasing certain areas more than other areas. So again, it can be pretty useful if it's generally a saturating source or generally a desaturating source. But again, there's these limitations of averages that no one will ever create an average value for color that's going to be perfect because it always has these limitations. So again, working these in a two-axis system together. So if we plot that gamut that I just described versus the fidelity index, we can see that there's a trade-off between the two. So there's only one point where we can be exactly the same as the reference. That's there. So fidelity of 100, we have to have the same gamut because that means all of those chromaticity comparisons are identical. As we start moving away, we can either be boosting saturation, decreasing saturation on average, or just creating hue shifts, which would be sort of moving along this RG 100 line. So it forms this nice two-axis system where you can work those two numbers together to understand roughly the effect that the source is going to have. And we'll go through a demonstration, and I think we'll show you how this two-axis system can work. It's also important, if we, again, talk about that core calculation engine I mentioned, if you try and just pair sort of two measures together that don't sort of come from the same system, you lose that relationship. So now it's not obvious. Now I have multiple sources with different amounts of saturation change that are all called fidelity of 100. Now that doesn't work very well, at least in my thinking. So again, talking about what manufacturers will probably provide, this is going back now, circling around to the high-level overview again. Color fidelity, similarity to the reference, fidelity index RF, scale roughly 0 to 100. Color gamut, the average level of saturation relative to the reference. As I mentioned on that two-axis plot, there's sort of a relationship between the two, so there's no defined limits here. But when you're above an RF of 60, you're talking about 60 to 140 as your approximate range there. Then you can supplement that with the color vector graphic to get more information about what's going on actually in the reds or blues or greens that these average numbers can't tell you. So you can look at that, as I mentioned, just visually, graphically. We can break that down into numbers if you're trying to write a spec. Okay, so I'll go through the Excel tool. Any questions about what those values mean? Anything else related to those sort of the outputs that are coming out of TM30? Answered a bunch of them already. Nope. All right, so I'm going to have to sit down here. I don't know if I'll be still in the video screen or not. Let's see here. And this is going to be interesting. I've got to get my mouse over there. 1 second. There we go. So this is one of the two calculators that come with the TM if you purchase it from IES. So there's a basic one and an advanced one. Basic one has sort of more limitations on what you can actually put into it. There's sort of a fixed wavelength interval and range and things that you have to put into it. The advanced one allows a bit more flexibility. So when you open it up, there's an instruction screen, explain a lot of what I'm explaining now, and I'm sure this is pretty small for some of you in the back. There's descriptions of all the sheets. Where everything really goes on is this main tab. So there's sort of three ways to input information. We have a drag down boxes here. So there's libraries of sources. I can pull up any of these, and it will calculate all of the measures that I just showed you from this library. There's about 300 sources in there right now. They're not named sort of whose is whose. They're more just in there. You can play around with it. You can see there were CIE sources. There's sort of generic F32T8-930. Again, they're not named. This isn't meant to be able to use to specify these sources. You need to actually get the real information for these sources. But there's a library in there that it comes with just to help get you started. I can also use an SPDX file format. This is just TM27, I believe, was just issued. So this is an electronic format for spectral data. You can click on this, import that data, and it will calculate it for you. I don't have any on my computer right now. It's not really in widespread use yet.
So this comes with the TM30. When you buy the copy of TM30, is it a disk at the back of it, or you downloaded it from the IES website?
It's a download from the IES website. So there's a link. It's on the table of contents page of the TM. And I'm guessing you're all members here. So, I mean, you should all have access. Be able to download it straight from that link. The other way you can do it is if you have your own spectral power distribution, you can paste it. You have to set what was the starting wavelength, what was the ending wavelength, what was the interval being, so this is 380, 381, that's 1 nanometer. So you can paste all that information. I just preloaded some in the library today that we can look at and sort of go through, sort of see a little more about what's included in here. So I'm just going to pull up one here, sort of halogen lamp. So it's very similar to the reference. It's a black body radiator, obviously, same color temperature. It deviates here. There's some filters on the glass to keep some of the heat out, the infrared radiation. So that's why it deviates here. But because it's so similar to the reference, obviously, the RF score, RG score, it's at the pinnacle of this two-axis system here. So again, it's important to think, though, is that necessarily the best source for an application? It might be at the pinnacle of fidelity, but is an incandescent source, if I'm trying to distinguish between blues, the best source for my application? So it's important to think, where do I maybe want to increase saturation? So some people, for example, might like the neodymium incandescent lamp, which I can show you here. So now my fidelity went down because it's not as similar to that black body radiator. My saturation on average went up. And in particular, if I look at the vector graphics here, I'm increasing the saturation of reds and greens a little bit. So a lot of people like this source. Some people didn't like this source. It kind of probably depends on what you're using it for. If I'm concerned about color matching, probably not the best source. If I'm trying to make a retail store look good and the colors pop, might be a better source. If I'm in an amusement park and I want everything to look very colorful, might be a good source. But TM30 really allows us to make that distinction more so than using a fidelity value alone. My fidelity, if I only consider that, it's lower. And I have no way to know why it's lower, so you're just going to think it's worse. It's not necessarily worse for any application, it's just different. Yep, so I can show here, I'm decreasing my fidelity, but I'm increasing my saturation.
Does it only work on PC version of Excel, or Excel?
So the basic version works on both Mac and PC. Mac has issues with some of the macros that are in this version. We're working on a Mac fix for it, but the advanced version doesn't work on a Mac right now. We went through a lot of trouble with that, actually. It was kind of a pain. So just some of the other tabs here. You can go to this other tab and get a lot more of the results. Chromaticity comparisons, there's a lot more numbers as well. Same types of charts I've been showing. You can see a visual representation of the shift for each of these samples. Again, it's a computer-generated thing, not perfect, but it can kind of give you an idea of what's going on. I can look at each of the 16 Hue bins, or I can look at all 99 samples.
Where do you buy the actual samples?
You can't. You can't actually buy them.
So where do they exist?
They're all. It's computers. So they came from a library of 105,000 objects that someone had measured. We basically collected all this. Different researchers have measured objects for different things. There's a flowers database. There's skin databases. There's commercial inks databases. There's natural objects databases. We pulled that all together and made sort of a set of 100,000 objects. We picked from that to get the features, the spectral uniformity and the even coverage of color space based on these 99 samples.
But if your screen is calibrated differently than mine, then those numbers or those.
So it's all done mathematically. There's not any actual visual evaluation in the system. So it's all done with that reflectance function is what we're considering, not these actual digital representation. It's the actual function behind it. I can click through a few more here, might be of interest. So let's pull up something with very distorting. Let's see, 56. High pressure sodium. Everyone's favorite lighting. If you read the New York Times, it creates that very lovely emotion. I don't know if everyone's read that, but yeah. So you see, big distortions. It's not even on the way the axes are defined there. It's off the chart. Yeah. So say fluorescent lamp. Maybe we'll pull RF32. So again, it's very low. The CRI 17. It actually does a little better with RF, but and it's a very desaturating source as well. Sort of double whammy of not good.
So you said the G value was 60 to 140 was good?
Rough 60 to 140 is the range. What's good really depends on the application. Right? That's sort of the whole second part of this talk is getting into that.
Now that range, you had a limitation that the fidelity had to be over 60, and we're down at 32 here.
So that range was, where's my mouse again?
Was the fidelity or the
Sorry, I gotta find the mouse and get it on this screen. So that's the range of possible values. So if I look at this plot, the white area is the range of possible values. So that's why when I'm above 60, it's roughly 60 to 140. So you can't have values as you get the lower RF. That value of RG expands. But this is sort of the practical region that most of us are considering.
So now our color-tunable LEDs, as they move through, the plot's going to go all over the place, right? Depending on how good they are, the fidelity is going to change, and hue is going to change differently.
So that's kind of a good segue. If anyone wants to look at this a bit later, I know it's probably hard for a lot of you to see. It's small on the screen, but we can come up afterwards and do this. I'm going to pull up now. Andrew's going to help me. So we have a tunable LED over here, and we have some objects. And this will just sort of illustrate some of these things visually. I think it's helpful for you to see. And to the people in Eugene, this might be hard to see. But come to Portland, and I'll give you a demonstration. So I got to switch over here. Okay. So go ahead, Andrea. I can turn this on. I'm going to turn some lights off. That's pretty good. And again, this is a pretty small demonstration.
Do you mind just giving one where the others we can't
Okay, so on the screen there's going to be a matching sort of set of these images that I pulled out of the calculator tool that correspond to each of these. So I just measured the spectral power distribution, plugged it into my calculator, and you can produce all this information. So this one is a very high fidelity source. It's a 7 LED source, and so that's the spectral power distribution that I created here. These are all the same CCT, all the same output, as close as I could get them in a reasonable amount of calibration time. So you can see moving through this plot here, this one's up here, very high fidelity, gamut score of 100. So all these samples, it renders everything pretty well. You know, this was very similar to the reference, which is 3500K black body radiation. So we can change to the next one. So Andrea, that's number 1. And watch this. So if you go back and forth between those two, it takes a second to load them up. So there's the original. That's what's up now. 2, yeah. So what are you on right now? Sorry. 1? 1? Okay.
Follow your slides.
This is 1? It doesn't look like 1.
Okay, so they go to 2?
Okay, it is 1. So we moved here. So compared to that other one, this is very dissimilar from the reference in terms of fidelity, but it's increasing saturation. So this has a RF of 65. It has a CRI of 50. I would bet most of you wouldn't think that has a CRI of 50. That's a really low value for CRI. Most of you would never even consider using something like that in an architectural environment. It doesn't look horrible. I mean, it's all a bit subjective, but kind of illustrates the point that different regions in here, if you're increasing saturation, for example, might not be unusable for a certain type of space, or might actually be better than that perfect fidelity source.
I'm going to go back to 7.
Okay, yep. So again, 7 is the highest fidelity, most similar to the reference.
1?
And then 1 is actually boosting the saturation here, especially of reds and greens. If you look at the vector graphic, it really shows that. Now I'll go to another one here. Number 2. It's on 2. So 2 is very desaturating. So you notice that the colors don't look very good there, in my opinion. So a lot of times when we desaturate, it's not the most preferred source for any application, really. You'll notice here at the same time, talking about the limitations of CRI. So these have the same fidelity score according to TM30. This one actually has a CRI of 75. The previous one that people generally thought was pretty good, I mean, reasonable, had a CRI of 50. So this one's rated way higher, but I think all of you would say the other one looked much more natural. This one's very distorted to me. Okay, we can go to a different set here. Go to number 3. So again, this one's higher fidelity value, pretty much same fidelity CRI value as the last one, but a much higher RF score in terms of TM30, and we're sort of neutral on the gamut. So we're desaturating some areas and saturating others. And in this case, we're saturating the reds a little bit. And I compare that to the next one, go to number 4, and watch the change up there, don't watch it up here. So again, it's another limitation of the averages. So these have the same average values. They're both right about here, right about a fidelity score of 80 and a neutral gamut. But this one's doing the opposite of the other one. So it's desaturating reds and saturating the yellows and the blues. So some of these limitations of the average, it'd be nice to just only consider the 2 numbers. No matter what you do with those averages, though, going to that next level of information is going to provide a lot more detail to get what you want. So these vector graphics or the numerical versions over there on the left. Go ahead to the next one, Andrea. Number 5. So this is pretty similar to a neodymium incandescent, very saturating. So 80 fidelity, score of 115 average increasing gamut, and it's pretty much increasing gamut all around. So this could be a good source for certain applications. Very colorful is sort of how I would describe it. Go ahead to the next one. Sort of the opposite effect here, number 6. So we're decreasing the gamut pretty much all around. Same fidelity level. So all those last 4 sources, same fidelity. So that's what, if you consider fidelity alone, you miss a whole lot of information about how those were all varying. So we can play with this more later. I'll continue on a little bit to some ongoing research. So many of these objects were here. This is a room we had here in Portland where we brought in subjects. And we had 26 different lighting settings using a very similar source to that one there, created in this space. So we created those 26 settings, sort of that same range you just saw, from very saturating, very desaturating, this full triangle in that RFG space. And at each point, we sort of shifted the gamut one way or the other. So we either saturated reds or desaturated reds as much as possible. So this is the general results. And I want to point out that this is in one space that was sort of application agnostic. So, this isn't a retail store or a residence or an office. It's sort of this unique space that we created with a bunch of objects in it. And this is going to be pretty context dependent, but I think this gives an idea of how you can examine this under any given context. It's just one example. So if we look at the combined score, this sort of heat map over here, the red is what was least liked, the green is what was most liked. The numbers correspond to the averages on a scale of 0 to 8 on whether they was liked or disliked. Other interesting things, so if we separate out where the red was desaturated versus saturated, much less preferred when it's not reaching that red saturation level, much more preferred with the red saturating level. So if we look even again at the averages, very different based on those same averages based on whether it's going one way or the other way, as you saw yourselves. For example, those 2 sources right there, the averages certainly have limitations. Okay, so thinking about this in other contexts, what might you want to be doing in different places? So we got to break away from this idea that we always want the maximum fidelity number, the highest CRI value, because that's not always necessarily the case. In an office, actually the thing driving it is probably efficacy. We need to have reasonable efficacy. You probably want just a neutral gamut is fine. It's not really a color critical type of place. Say contrast that with an amusement park. There I'm trying to make it look as colorful as possible probably. I want the source that makes saturation as great as possible, and that's going to mean necessarily that I have a lower fidelity value. So anytime I'm changing the saturation, that's a deviation from the reference, so it's lower fidelity. Say a more application in stores, grocery store, I might want to saturate things to make them look a little better. You got to be careful a little bit because things like meat, you can make bad meat look good, and there's actually regulations against doing that. Something in a store, though, is something more sort of thought-provoking. I can make those clothing in the store look really good, but it might not look good now when the person walks outside and when they get at home. So that can lead to an increased rate of returns. What does the store care about? Do they just want to sell the product? If they increase their rate of returns too much, what happens? So again, in that situation, maybe you want reasonably high fidelity, but you're trying to boost saturation a little bit to make those colors really pop. So again, the way TM30 works, it doesn't have a single number that says this is the best source, because the reason for that is all these applications have different needs. And so you can use the numbers together and look at this suite of information to really figure out what is the best for this application. So this sort of plays into criteria and specifications. What source is better? This higher is better mentality, that's probably not actually true. This is sort of the way we think sometimes. But again, we have these variable things with gamut and especially the icon shape very strongly. So what could happen with specifications going forward? Could keep using CRI, that's still on the books. It's convenient to just keep using the same thing, but we leave a lot of information off on the table, I guess. Replace it with RF. Don't say anything about RG. That sort of creates a minimum of acceptability, but gives freedom for manufacturers and users to play around with saturation levels and get what they need for the application. You could specify limits for both RF and RG. Again, do you start then getting into the situation where you're specifying out sources that would actually be useful in certain applications? And that's something to be aware of in types of specifications. Include nothing, well then you're just going to probably have high energy efficiency and terrible color. Or at least for the meantime, say an and/or type of approach, you have to meet a CRI specification or an RF type of specification. So this is always sort of interesting, thought-provoking. What happens to scores? Just comparing fidelity now, because that's all we can compare to with CRI. The one axis CRI, the RA value, IES RF. If everything stayed exactly the same, it would fall immediately on this thin red line going diagonal here. So you can see what actually happens is that a lot of sources that were engineered to have high CRI values are no longer optimized when you change the test. If we have a harder test, you could have studied really well for those 8 questions. Now you got asked 99 questions and you can't do quite as well. So a lot of these scores go down, especially meeting the ones that are above 80, because that's usually the threshold that's been around in a lot of different places. You can see also a lot of the ones that are dropping, so this is broken out by source type, the very narrow band sources, where that narrow bands of radiation were specifically placed at a wavelength that boosted that CRI score and maintained a very high efficacy. So what happens if I just switch my criteria to RF of 80, all these sources previously qualified no longer qualify. Those didn't qualify before, don't qualify now. Those ones didn't qualify before, now do qualify. So just something to think about, that simply swapping out one criteria for another, you're going to really change a lot what happened. Now, if these sources were visually acceptable before, they should be visually acceptable now. The way we quantify it doesn't affect at all your visual evaluation of what is acceptable or not. So this comes down to what are the appropriate criteria and how do we set those criteria for a new system. So I can simply change this and say, well, I want to go instead to IES RF 75, and there I have only a very few sources that previously qualified that no longer would. So it's important to think, it's not a straight one-to-one relationship between the two. Question?
When you were showing us the real light samples there, you went from the first one that I think you said was number 7, went to the other one that was really saturated. That I think most of us agreed with you that it had really good color. And I thought we were down at an RF of something like 50 on that one.
65.
So we would have thrown it out here, right?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, that was down at an RF of 65, and I think, I didn't ask for a show of hands, but how many have thought that would be a reasonable source to use in certain applications? Probably a lot of you. So that's something important to think about when we now specify. But then the next source I showed you was very desaturating, also RF of 65, and many of you would probably say that's not acceptable. So that's why, again, if we have only a criteria of fidelity, we lose a lot of that information. So sort of having a minimum fidelity value that's a little bit higher can take out some of those problem sources, but it might be now that we actually can't have just a minimum based on one metric, fidelity. And so if we consider that 2-axis plot again, it might be a jagged area instead of just a cutoff, everything above fidelity of a certain number is what's appropriate. And really, it might come down to what's best for applications. Again, it's different regions of that plot. R9, I'm going to just sort of skip through these and go to questions. If you want R9 is nothing special. It was just one sample. If we combine the samples out of Hue Bins 1 and 2, that covers sort of the range before and after R9. So we can get a much better representation of red rendering with Hue Bins 1 and 2. If I look at this example, and so R9 on this source, they're pretty similar, but this source renders other reds very poorly, where this source doesn't have that drop. So that's why considering one sample as representative of all reds is kind of problematic. And we can solve that with TM30 using those broader Hue Bin averages. A couple updates, things you'll be seeing coming out. This is sort of a statement of support published in Lighting Research and Technology. It's sort of an open letter describing TM30. We distributed it to some people. A lot of people signed on as supporting it. That'll be published, I believe, in the December issue of Lighting Research and Technology. Starting to see data being published by manufacturers. The IES has issued a position statement. CIE is either drafted or just issued a position statement. The GLA has a position statement. NEMA is probably working on a white paper soon. So everyone is sort of figuring out how this works for them, what are their concerns. Again, there is potential to review this document and make changes. It's going through CIE now. And that's sort of one step in that process of this is a baseline, using it, revising it, and reaching industry consensus. Conclusions aren't anything unique. There's a bunch of links in this presentation. There were 2 webinars on this that we did for DOE, 3 hours in total of material. Those links are there. What else was that? There are a couple of our journal articles, one in there, in the actual TM30. If you want more reading, take time. You can also email me, ask questions. I answer a lot of questions actually on this. Try to respond as much as possible to everyone sending emails. And I'll take some questions now. I know a lot of you already asked them. So.
You might want to mention it's on the DOE website too, Zoom, the responses to all the questions.
Oh yeah, so yeah, all the questions I receive, I'm sort of trying to make a FAQ section that'll be on the DOE SSL webpage. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, microphone, hold on.
Thank you. So, and I did go through this briefly, the TM30. Nice job, by the way. I don't understand all of it, I'll admit to that.
Yeah,
but it's pretty interesting stuff. The one thing I was wondering, and it's really an issue more of intention, but the one advantage I think this can be applied to, and I'd like your opinion is, when we have multiple light sources within a space now, I think it's going to be a lot easier with this information to get complementary sources. I mean, we can have same color temperature and we can have the same CRI and very different effects to the point that one wall will look different in color than the other walls in the same room. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me this is going to give us some ammunition and methodology for getting those sources much closer to each other.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. A lot of matching sources in a space is chromaticity, and CCT is a pretty coarse characterization of chromaticity. So if you add DUV to that, you get a little more information. But you could still have sources with the exact same chromaticity, all 7 of those right there, and even with the same fidelity score that are very different. And so, yeah, you get that much more deeper level of information to try and match sources. So if you could exactly match an icon shape for 2 sources, you'd know they'd render things pretty much identically. Other questions? You can come. We can do more demo if anyone wants to stick around. Happy to stay for a few minutes. Question?
Will we have presentations to put on the IES website, or is it on the DOE website? If they want to get the links and stuff?
Yeah, I can give it to you.
Okay, perfect. So it will be on the IES website. IESOR.org website.
It's a lot to digest. I listened to both of those seminars,
Mm-hmm.
and was like,
Yeah.
I don't think I'm stupid by any means, but it was.
Well, there's a lot more information to try and understand. You know, it's pretty easy when you have CRIs. Oh, I want the higher number. It's better. That led to a lot of challenges. I mean, if that's all you want to still consider is fidelity, and CRI goes away, there's still a fidelity value in here, and you could just look at RF and pick the higher number. Will your sources be the best ones for an application? Probably not. I mean, if that's simplicity versus, the best sources, there's a trade-off there.
How soon after all this starts becoming standard in the practice do you think people will start coming up with combinations that they consider what people people emote in a certain way or not.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like sound, it's a warm sound or it's a sharp sound. And for people on lighting, it's always been, well, I have eyes, but I see all these colors differently. But there's some bands where people consider, like, you know, what's always considered 3700K. People figure that's a nice warm room, but it isn't just at 3700K. There's more to it. And how long do you think, after this becomes standard practice, that people will have these little charts of this is considered a warm room and this is considered a space?
I can't speak to the exact timeline on it. It sort of depends how fast people want to make it move. You know, my job right now is to go around. I talk at a lot of conferences. I'm conveniently here in Portland too, and I can speak here and just sort of provide education. It's up to users really to figure out how can I use this and what types of sources do I want to target. You know, we have that library in the Excel file so that you can sort of look through all these sources I'm familiar with. I know I like that one a lot, and that's what I want to always go for. I can sort of figure out, okay, those are the values for that. That's what its gamut shape is. So that's sort of what I want to target for this application. Anyone who's had experience in lighting design probably has ideas in their head already. And there's a lot of individuality in terms of personally and application in terms of what is the preferred or best light source.
So now with LEDs, when you have 100 downlights and all 100 may be using different, I mean, maybe they're not completely different, but there's going to be a lot of variations even in the same output, the same color, the same everything. So would you need, like, it's not really equal unless you're specifying exactly same chip, same reflector, same, you know, everything, which is, you know, going to be very difficult to do. So how does that affect, or does it, on this whole 3-name spec? Or, I mean, we're running a lot with LEDs already. You can't really, you have to look at every single piece and you say, yeah, this is what I selected, and the other ones, sometimes you list because you have to, or, you know, people reluctant to know we don't want 1-name specs, so you need to, but they're not really equal.
Yeah.
So what does it do to that? Or how, I mean, it's a lot of extra time to evaluate, test, look at all those graphs and...
Sort of the broader issue of the product variation, I don't know how much it addresses that, but what it does do is provide a lot more information. If you want to write a much tighter spec to get exactly what you want in terms of color rendering, it obviously doesn't address all the other issues with product variation, but if you want to write a much tighter spec for color rendering, it certainly allows you to do that.
Just put your RF, RG.
Put RF, put RG. If you're concerned about reds, put Hue Bin 1 has to be a certain thing. If you are concerned, if there's any deviation, you know, say I want a minimum for all 16 values of some X, Y, whatever you deem appropriate. You can get a much tighter spec by that, just by virtue of there's a whole lot more information being characterized. All right, thanks a lot.